The plum was half rotten, split on one side where it had struck the ground, its flesh gone soft and brown at the edges. Clara Holt ate it anyway. She stood at the edge of a rutted Montana road and ate every bit of it down to the pit, wiping the juice from her chin with the back of her hand, and she did not allow herself to feel ashamed. She was 23 years old. She had $0.14 in the pocket of her gray wool skirt, a carpet bag that held a change of clothes and a ledger book she had carried for 3 years, and a set of circumstances that would have broken a woman with less spine. Her father's mercantile in Billings had been seized the previous spring not because he had mismanaged it, but because he had trusted a business partner who had not deserved it. The partner had taken the inventory, the accounts, and most of the cash, and had left town on a westbound train before the creditors arrived. Her father had died of a stroke 6 weeks later. The doctor said it was his heart. Clara knew better. It was the humiliation that killed him. A man of his generation did not survive being made a fool of. She had stayed long enough to settle what debts she could, sell what remained, and bury him properly. Then she had done what she always did when the options were gone. She moved toward what was still possible. The road she was on cut through a valley so wide and still that the mountains in the distance looked like something painted on the edge of the world. The grass was the color of old straw, bent flat by an October wind that had no patience for anything that couldn't hold its ground. A hawk turned slow circles over a ridge to the west. Everything else was silence. She had walked 6 miles from the last town. The town had offered nothing, no work, no lodging she could afford, and one hotel keeper who had looked at her traveling alone and assumed things about her character that Clara had set right with a look cold enough to frost glass. She had kept walking. The sound of wagon wheels reached her before she saw it. A freight wagon coming from the north, moving at a working pace. The 2 draft horses steady and unhurried. The driver was a man somewhere between 40 and 50, with a heavy red beard going gray at the edges. He pulled up without being asked. He looked at her bag. He looked at the road behind her and the road ahead. He looked at her face with the direct, appraising squint of a man who spent his days reading weather and terrain. "Helena Road's back that way," he said. It was not unfriendly. It was information. "I'm not going to Helena," Clara said. He let that sit for a moment. "Reardon Place is about 2 miles on," he said. "They've been short a cook since August." He said it simply, the way a man mentions that a loose board needs fixing. Then he clicked his tongue, and his horses moved on. Clara watched the wagon go. She turned and looked at the 2 miles of road ahead of her. She picked up her bag and walked. The Reardon Ranch sat against the base of a long, low ridge, like something that had grown there organically, the way rock grows from a hillside. It was not pretty. No one had built it with beauty in mind. The main house was 2 stories of weathered pine, solid as the ground it stood on, with a covered porch running the full length of the front. The barn was bigger than the house, which said everything you needed to know about the priorities of the man who built it. Corrals, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a root cellar. Everything purposeful, nothing wasted. A boy of about 12 was splitting wood at the side of the house. He stopped when Clara came through the gate and stared at her with the frank curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned to hide it. "I'm looking for work," Clara said. "I was told there might be a position here." The boy set his axe down carefully and went inside at a run. The man who came out was not what she expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say what she had expected. He was perhaps 35, tall in the way of men who had done hard physical work since boyhood. His face was angular and sun-darkened, with a jaw that suggested a man who made decisions and didn't revisit them. His eyes were a deep, quiet brown, the color of creek water in autumn, and they assessed her with an intelligence that had nothing to do with book learning. He came down the porch steps and stopped at a respectful distance. He was carrying his hat in his hand, which she noted. His name was James Reardon. He offered it right away, which she also noted. He looked at her bag. He looked at the road behind her, just as the wagon driver had. Then he looked at her face, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being read the way a man reads a map. "You cook?" he asked. "Since I was 8 years old," Clara said. My mother ran the kitchen for a threshing outfit in Nebraska. 30 men, 3 meals a day, through harvest. I kept her books and stood at her elbow from the time I could reach the stove. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the corral, a horse stamped and blew. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Billings," she said. She did not elaborate. He did not press. He looked at the house. He looked back at her. "I've got 8 hands through the fall gather, 2 more arriving Thursday. Kitchen's been managed by whoever had time, which means it hasn't been managed at all." He paused. "I can offer room, board, and fair wages." "I'd need to see the kitchen first," Clara said. Something moved in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. He stepped aside and gestured toward the door. The kitchen was, in her private assessment, a catastrophe and a challenge in equal measure. The stove was a good one, a heavy iron range that could heat 6 burners, but it was coated in the evidence of months of neglect. Grease had rendered itself into a permanent glaze on every surface. The flour bin held approximately 4 cups of flour and several uninvited guests. The root cellar she found through a door off the back wall was better. Potatoes, onions, dried beans, several jars of put-up tomatoes, a side of salt pork hanging from a hook. Someone had been growing food all summer, even if no one had been cooking it properly. She walked through the kitchen slowly, opening doors and lifting lids with the focused calm of a woman doing arithmetic in her head. James Reardon stood in the doorway and watched her. "The root cellar is well stocked," she said finally. "Whoever put this up knew what they were doing." "My sister," he said. "She was here through the summer. She's gone back to her husband's family in Oregon now." Clara nodded. She set her bag down beside the door. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook behind the door. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow. "I'll need 3 buckets of hot water, a fresh bar of lye soap, and about 4 hours," she said. "Then I'll need to go through your accounts." He blinked. It was the first time she had seen his composure falter, even slightly. "My accounts? If I'm managing this kitchen, I need to know what comes in and what goes out. What you've been spending on supplies, what you have coming in from the fall gather. A kitchen doesn't run on goodwill and leftover flour." She met his gaze directly. "I'm not asking to run your ranch, Mr. Reardon. I'm asking to run my kitchen properly." He studied her for a long, still moment. Then he nodded once and went to get the buckets. The first week reshaped the ranch in ways that were hard to name precisely. Clara rose before daylight. She had the coffee on and the first round of biscuits in the oven before the hands came in from morning chores. She fed them the way her mother had taught her, abundantly, without fuss, with enough hot food that no man left the table wondering if there would be more. Pinto beans, slow-cooked with salt, pork, and green onion. Skillet cornbread with a crust that crackled. Roast beef sliced thin and piled high on a platter. Dried apple pie with a crust that shattered at the fork. The hands were skeptical at first, in the way of men who have learned not to expect much. They came in at supper the first evening, still wearing their guard, and they left it somewhere around the second helping. By the end of the week, they wiped their boots without being asked. They stopped swearing at the table. One of them, a young hand named Cody, who had the look of someone's younger brother, started bringing firewood in without anyone telling him to, stacking it neatly beside the back door in the morning. Clara noticed. She said nothing. But the next morning, there was a slice of pie set aside on the warming shelf, with Cody's name written on a strip of paper beside it. James Reardon noticed that, too. He was a man who watched things. He watched the way his horses moved to know their health. He watched the sky to know the weather. He had spent 15 years learning to read the particular silences and rhythms of ranch life, and he was good at it. Now he found himself watching Clara Holt in the same way, with the focused attention of a man trying to understand something important. He watched the efficient certainty of her hands as she worked, the way she organized a workspace without being taught to, the way she spoke to his ranch hands, not softly, not harshly, but with the matter-of-fact directness of a person who respected them enough not to waste their time. He watched the way the kitchen itself transformed under her management, not just in cleanliness, but in atmosphere, the smell of the place changing from stale grease and cold coffee to something that made a man feel, without quite knowing why, that the world was orderly and good. He began to find reasons to be in the kitchen. He brought her the accounts without being asked a second time. He set the ledger on the table one evening after supper with a diffidence that was almost shy, from a man who was not shy about anything else. She opened it and read it for 20 minutes without speaking. He sat at the other end of the table with his coffee, watching the firelight move across her face. "You're carrying the note on the breeding stock through the First Territorial Bank in Missoula," she said, not looking up. "Yes," he said. "When is it due?" "1st of December." She turned a page. "Your fall gather is projected at how many head?" 430. Maybe 440. She was quiet for a moment, running a column of figures with her pencil. "At current Missoula market rates, that covers the note and gives you margin for the winter." "That's my calculation too," he said. She looked up then. Her eyes met his. "But you didn't come to me with this ledger to confirm your own calculation, Mr. Reardon." He was quiet. "There's something you haven't told me," she said. "Not an accusation. Just a fact, stated plainly." He set his coffee cup down. He looked out the dark window for a moment. "The weather's been wrong all fall," he said finally. "First cold snap came 3 weeks early. The cattle pushed down out of the high pastures before the gather could finish. I'm missing somewhere between 30 and 40 head, still up in the breaks. The snow gets deep early up there." He stopped. "You may not get them down before it closes in," Clara said quietly. "Yes." She looked at the ledger. She looked at the figures she had written. The margin she had calculated was thin enough that losing 30 to 40 head at market would not merely shrink it, it would eliminate it. She did not say this. He knew it. She closed the ledger. She did not offer false comfort, and she did not offer despair. She simply said, "I'll think on it." He looked at her as if she had offered him something he hadn't known he was in need of. Then he said good night and went to bed. She thought on it for 3 days. She thought on it while she made bread and while she stirred the bean pots and while she walked to the root cellar in the sharp October cold. She was not a woman who arrived at answers quickly. She was a woman who built them the way her father had built shelves carefully, with good joints, tested before weight was put on them. On the 3rd day, she walked out to the corral in the early afternoon, when she knew James Reardon would be doing his inventory count. She stood at the fence rail and watched him work for a while. Then she said, without preamble, "Do you have any steers you've been holding back?" He looked up from his tally book. 3, he said. "Young ones that weren't going to make weight for the drive. I penned them up behind the barn. I've been taking kitchen waste out to the creek pasture every morning," Clara said. "Peelings, stale bread, the whey off the butter. A pig would eat it, but you don't have pigs. Thought I'd keep it from going to waste." He looked at her for a moment. "Those steers have been getting it," he said slowly. "Yes, since my 2nd week." She paused. "I had a look at them this morning, Mr. Reardon. They're not the same animals they were a month ago." He set his tally book down on the fence post and walked back behind the barn. Clara followed. The 3 steers were, in fact, no longer the scrubby, ribby animals that had been deemed unfit for market. 5 weeks of supplemental feeding on kitchen waste, the caloric scraps of feeding 10 men 3 meals a day had filled them out in a way that was unmistakable to anyone who knew cattle. James Reardon stood at the fence of the small pen and looked at his 3 steers for a long time. Clara stood beside him. "There are 3 of them," he said finally. "At Missoula market rates, a prime steer runs between $38 and $42, Clara said. "Call it 40, to be conservative. That's $120. She paused. "It doesn't replace 40 head, but it changes the shape of the problem." "It changes the shape of the problem," he repeated quietly. He turned and looked at her. She looked back at him without flinching or looking away, because she never flinched and never looked away, and he had come to understand that about her. He was still looking at her when the sound of an unfamiliar horse came from the front of the house. The man who stepped down from the buggy wore a coat that cost more than most ranch hands made in 2 months. His boots were clean, conspicuously, deliberately clean, in a yard where cleanliness of that order was a statement. He introduced himself as Mr. Fitch, representing the interests of the First Territorial Bank of Missoula, and he smiled at James Reardon the way a man smiles when he already knows how a conversation is going to end. He had heard, he explained, that the fall gather had run short. Difficult weather, unfortunate timing. The bank was sympathetic, of course. The bank wanted nothing more than to see hard-working men like Mr. Reardon succeed, which was why the bank was prepared to offer a very reasonable arrangement. A restructuring of the note, extended terms, more manageable payments, in exchange, naturally, for a deed of trust on the northern pasture, which the bank assessed at a very fair value. The northern pasture was a third of the ranch. James Reardon's jaw was a hard line. He said nothing. Fitch spoke into his silence, with the practiced ease of a man who had mistaken silence for surrender before. Clara had been in the kitchen when she heard the buggy. She had come to the doorway of the dining room and stood there, listening, with a dish towel still in her hands. She listened to Fitch explain the terms. She listened to the language he used, sympathetic, inevitable, reasonable, and she recognized every word of it. Her father had heard words like these. He had believed they meant what they said. She walked into the room. Fitch turned and looked at her with the mild irritation of a man whose arithmetic is being interrupted. "Excuse me, ma'am. This is a private business." "I work here," Clara said pleasantly. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table without being invited. She set the dish towel aside and folded her hands in front of her. "Please continue, Mr. Fitch." He blinked. He looked at James Reardon, who said nothing and made no move to remove her. Fitch recalibrated and continued. When he had finished outlining the terms, Clara said, "What is the current balance of the note?" Fitch looked at her. "I'm sorry?" "The outstanding balance on the breeding stock note." "What is it, precisely?" He quoted the figure. She had already known it from the ledger. "And the due date is December 1st, she said. "That's correct." "I see." She was quiet for a moment. She reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a folded piece of paper. She had been carrying it for 3 days. She unfolded it now and spread it on the table. It was a single page of figures, written in her neat, precise hand, the tallied value of the 3 fattened steers, the current market rate in Missoula, the date of the next cattle car east, the projected sale price after freight. She turned it so Fitch could read it. "If 3 head from this ranch ship to the Missoula yards on Friday's car," she said, "the proceeds cover approximately 1/3 of the outstanding balance. Combined with the 430 head from the fall gather," she tapped the column of figures with one finger. "Mr. Reardon clears the note in full with a margin of $60. Fitch stared at the paper. The smile had not left his face, but it had changed in quality. "This is based on current market rates," he said carefully. "As I mentioned, the market has been softening. I checked the Missoula posted rates this morning at the telegraph office in town," Clara said. She had ridden in before dawn, before anyone was awake, and no one had known she'd gone. "They haven't moved in 3 weeks. The softening you're describing appears to be an anticipation rather than a fact." The room was very quiet. One of the hands she had heard them come in from the porch, drawn by the buggy, was standing in the kitchen doorway. Then 2 of them. Then all of them, quiet as smoke. Fitch looked at the figures again. He was a man accustomed to dealing with ranchers who were good at ranching and uncertain at numbers. He had not expected this. He had not expected her. "The bank will of course require full payment on the due date," he said at last. His voice had shed its warmth the way a tree sheds leaves in the cold. "Of course," James Reardon said. He had not spoken in 10 minutes. His voice was level and certain. "You'll have it." Fitch gathered his papers with the crisp efficiency of a man removing himself from a situation that had not gone as planned. He was courteous on his way out. He was thorough about closing the door. From the kitchen, someone let out a slow breath. Then Cody said, quietly, "Well, I'll be," and there was a sound that was not quite a cheer but was close enough. James Reardon did not look at the hands. He looked at Clara, who was refolding her piece of paper with the same unhurried calm she applied to everything, as though she had not just quietly and completely dismantled a man's entire plan for stealing 30% of this ranch. He tried to find words for what he was feeling. He was not a man who used words carelessly, and so when they failed him, he said nothing at all. He simply looked at her, and she looked back, and she gave the smallest nod acknowledgement, not pride, and then she picked up her dish towel and went back to the kitchen, because supper still needed to be made, and there were 10 men to feed. That night, he could not sleep. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the windwork at the eaves, and he thought about the woman in the room down the hall. He thought about who she was, not what she did, though what she did was extraordinary, but who she was underneath the doing of it, the steadiness of her, the complete absence of performance. She was not brave in the way of people who needed others to witness their bravery. She was brave the way a good foundation was solid, not because anyone was watching, but because that was simply its nature. She had arrived at this ranch with $0.14 and a ledger book, and she had, in 6 weeks, become the reason the whole operation worked, not by force, not by making herself indispensable through some clever strategy, simply by being, every single day, exactly what was needed. He thought about what the ranch would be without her. He had thought about this before and put the thought aside, because it led somewhere he wasn't ready to go. He was a careful man, careful with his land, careful with his animals, careful with his decisions. He had not been careful enough with his first marriage. His wife had been a woman who loved the idea of the West, without being suited to the reality of it. She had left after 2 winters, gone back to her family in Ohio, and they had parted without malice and without much surprise on either side. The ranch had been his since then, his entirely, which was to say empty in the way that entirely one's own things could be empty. He had learned not to need what he didn't have. Now what he didn't have was standing between him and everything he needed, and he was self-aware enough to see the irony clearly. He got up before dawn. He made the coffee himself, an act of domestic independence he had barely managed before her arrival, and he was standing on the back porch with a cup in his hand when she came out of her room in the gray pre-dawn light. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at the coffee. She looked at his face. "You've been thinking," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. He handed her the second cup he had poured, because he had poured 2 without quite deciding to. She took it. They stood side by side and looked at the valley. The mountains to the north were obscure in cloud. The first thin light was coming over the ridge to the east, cold and clean, touching the frost on the grass. "The fall gather ends next week," James said. He kept his voice steady. He was a man who had negotiated cattle prices and argued fence lines with neighbors and held his ground in every practical confrontation his life had offered. This was harder than any of it. "The hands will be paid off. The kitchen work slows down for winter." "I know," Clara said. She was looking at the mountains. "Your wages are paid through the end of the month," he said. "But you'd be within your rights to move on. Plenty of places between here and Helena that could use someone like you." She said nothing. She drank her coffee. "I'm asking you not to," he said. "Move on, I mean." He turned and looked at her directly, because he was not a man who said important things to the side of someone's face. "I'm not asking you to stay on as a cook, Clara. I'm asking you to stay as my wife." The valley was very still. The frost on the grass caught the first light and threw it back in 1,000 small directions. She looked at him for a long moment. He saw nothing in her expression that frightened him, no pity, no withdrawal, none of the things he had braced for without quite admitting he had braced for them. What he saw was the same thing he always saw in her face when she was considering a problem carefully. Thought, honesty, respect for the question. "You took a long time getting there," she said at last. "I know it," he admitted. "I've been here 6 weeks, James. I know that too." She looked back at the mountains. She took one more sip of her coffee. Then she said, "I'm not a woman who needs looking after. I want that understood from the beginning." "I know that," he said. "I'm not looking for someone to look after. I'm looking for—" He stopped. He found the right word. "A partner." She was quiet for one more moment. A single moment, long enough to be genuine, short enough to tell him she had already known her answer. "Then yes," she said. "I'll stay," he exhaled. He hadn't known until that moment how much air he had been holding. She glanced at him sidelong with a dry quality to her expression that he had come to love without yet having named it. "Now, let me make the biscuits," she said. "You've burned the first pot of coffee, and I have 8 men to feed." He laughed, a real one, unprepared, pulled out of him without permission. It was the first time she had heard him laugh like that, and she turned to look at him, and something in her expression shifted, the last thin reserve of distance dissolving all at once, and she smiled at him the way she had not yet smiled at anyone on this ranch, fully, without reservation, with her whole face. They were married on a Saturday in November, in the Reardon front room, by a traveling minister who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke the words of the ceremony with genuine feeling. The ranch hands stood in a row in their cleanest shirts, their hair combed flat and their expressions earnest. Cody cried and then denied it with great conviction. The wedding supper went on until nearly midnight, and the pie was extraordinary. 5 years later, a January morning, the Reardon Ranch sat against its ridge in the deep blue cold, smoke rising from 3 chimneys, the barn full, the corrals solid, the fence lines running straight and true to the horizon. A different banker from Missoula had ridden out the previous spring to discuss the possibility of financing an expansion of the breeding operation. He had brought his hat in hand, which was a reversal of the usual order of things, and James Reardon had considered his proposal with the unhurried calm of a man who had no particular need of anything being offered. Clara was in the kitchen, her kitchen, unambiguously hers after 5 years, with the ledgers open on the table and a cup of coffee going cold beside her, because she kept forgetting to drink it when she was working the numbers. Their daughter, Mathilde, age 4, was sitting on the kitchen floor threading dried beans onto a piece of twine with the focused concentration of someone doing important work. She had her father's brown eyes and her mother's precision, and the combined stubbornness of both of them, which was formidable. James came in from the cold, stomping the snow from his boots at the door. He came and stood behind Clara and looked over her shoulder at the ledgers. He put his hand on her shoulder. "Spring crew's going to be 12 men," he said, "up from 8. "I know," she said. "I've already adjusted the supply order." She tapped a column on the right side of the page. "I want to talk to you about the north section. I think we're underusing the creek pasture." "You've been thinking about the creek pasture since August," he said. He knew her rhythms by now, the long, quiet gestation of her ideas before they arrived fully formed. "I have," she admitted. "I think I have a plan." He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. He didn't tell her to go ahead. He didn't need to. He just looked at the ledger, and she began. Mathilde threaded another bean and looked up at her parents, side by side at the table, their heads bent together over the pages of figures, their voices low and sure and completely equal. She looked at them with the calm assessment of a 4-year-old, and then went back to her beans, because the work was not going to do itself. Outside, the snow came down clean and unhurried, covering the long Montana valley in silence, and the ranch held its ground against the winter the way it had always held its ground, because it was built right, and the people inside it knew what they were doing, and nothing that arrived uninvited had ever yet found a foothold here. Sometimes the most important thing a person can carry isn't money or certainty, it's the quiet knowledge of what they're capable of. Clara arrived with almost nothing, and she didn't wait to be rescued. She simply looked at what was in front of her and figured out what it could become. That's a skill worth more than any inheritance. The ability to see value where others see waste, and build something solid from it. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of entertainment and, hopefully, leave a little something worth carrying with you long after the last line.